Lecture of the second edition of the seminar Cocumint, Consumption of Cultural Goods as Driver of Migrant Integration. The seminar is interdisciplinary with contribution by economists, anthropologists, social scientists, linguists, and demographers. And also by an artist who is very involved in social inclusion. Last year we had Michelangelo Pistoletto. This year we had Marinella Senatore, who is a young, amazing artist. Today we are very happy and glad that Amin Moghadam accepted to lecture and to discuss with us. Amin has PhD in human geography and urban studies from the University Lyon 2, France. He lectured also on urban migration study at Sciences Po ex-Marseille University, at the Institut National des Langues et Civilisations Orientales. He has been associate research scholar at the Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Study at Princeton University until 2020. He's also now senior research associate in CERC, the chair in migration integration research led by Anna Triandafilitou at the Riverson University. In addition to research as teaching, he took a role in the he took on the role of the academic advisor for Master of Public Affairs program at Sciences Po in Paris and consulted for several organizations such as Louvre Abu Dhabi and UNHCR. His research publication focus on migration policy and practice, diaspora study, circulation and regional integration in the Middle East with focus on the Persian Gulf region. His publication, Staging of Cultural Diversity in Dubai, the case of Dubai Art Fair, is for sure very interesting for us. Amin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Venturini, for inviting me to this wonderful seminar and to give me the opportunity to talk about my new interest, I would say, in the material culture of diaspora and migration. So I added one word to the title that I had previously submitted, which is migration, just to add that my interest in the material culture and art practices is through, issues of migration and diaspora studies, as you kindly introduced me in the introduction. In my new research project in Toronto, since a few months ago, I look at the politics of home ownership of Iranian migrants in Toronto, and more broadly, I explore the way, dynamics of, as we call it in geography, space production in global cities intersects with politics of housing and homemaking from migrants' point of view. In my previous research, I worked on the art market in the Middle East, mainly in Dubai since 2000, and its relation with Iranian art scene. So I'm myself Iranian, and as Professor Venturini mentioned, I was educated in France. I'm mentioning these two works because in fact there are many commonalities between the art world and the market of the real estate. One is, of course, the rationale behind the market, both in the real estate and in the art world. And I'm actually sure that some of you know better than me, since I know that you are economists. Another similar point that I'm going to explore today is the way we can use materiality, our relationship to the material world, to talk about certain social spheres or social fields, such as the art world, and again, in relation with migration and diasporic dynamics, but also mobilities that sometimes go beyond migration or diaspora. So both in terms of artistic expressions that are created and produced and are often supposed to represent or embody certain ideas, but also the materiality of the environment of a given social field. Let's say, for instance, the city at the city level, or the architecture that is designed or created to host certain events, the type of commodities such as food or drinks that are consumed in certain events that also they contribute to social interactions, participate in the process of boundary making between different actors of, let's say, for instance, of the art world or any other social field in a very, I would say, Bourdieusian sense of it. So this way of looking at the material environment has been dubbed or coined as material culture in social sciences. It means some sort of analytical lens that allows us to use the material environment, but also our relationship to the material world to understand broader social phenomena. And I will get back to this definition a little bit later. So because we're talking about material culture, of course, one of the, the most important word in this is what is culture. And we had a discussion prior to this seminar with Professor Venturini, and I'm sure you had different discussions in this seminar. I know Peggy Levitt, that I'm using the definition of culture, gave a talk here. So it's important. I'm not going to expand too long, but it's important to mention what I mean here by culture, and what is the cultural component of the material culture. I'm going to propose some definition, actually, as I said, drawing on Peggy Levitt's work, who to give a kind of a framework for my discussion on material culture. The notion of culture, as you all know, is used in a variety of social and political fields. And it opens very often to many interpretations. Its use in the social sciences is often problematic. For example, when we are talking about migration or diasporic phenomena. The appropriation of concepts such as culture, cultural diversity, or cultural integration from the social sciences by the media, politics, and policy domain makes using them in a more epistemological scientific analysis tricky. So much so that even some social scientists, when they are tackling the migration cultural dimensions, they decide to use other concepts. Academics have sometimes abandoned the notion of culture in favor of a less politically charged notion, more compatible with the complexity of migration processes. This also varies a lot by context and discipline. For instance, in France, the mistrust of some sort of culturalist drift often leads social scientists to avoid the notion of culture as a structuring element of their research, because they're very soon, very quickly, they are accused of being culturalist. Critiques of the cultural analysis of migration, for instance, in France, they point out that by relying on cultural difference or distance, this approach leads to an essentialist vision which overlooks social constructs that evolve over time and are modified by the geography where they are produced and the power relations that also participate in their shaping. In contrast, academics in Anglo-Saxon world, broadly speaking, and North America, and I think to some extent in Italy probably, readily bring into play complex definition of culture. They place it at the heart of their analysis of migration phenomena. That cultural difference between academia is also very much probably related to the way they look at migration, to look at cultural diversity. But most of the researchers conducting cultural analysis of migration are often together in criticizing some sort of deterministic cultural approach under which culture is seen as a kind of immutable package or a geographical origin of an individual or group as the only factor explaining their situation in the context of their countries of destination. So I'm here using a definition that was useful to me in my work, and it's one definition among others that I found very dynamic, evolutive, and this is the definition of Peggy Levy, drawing on Alexandra Smith's definition of culture, and that's how she defines culture in one of her articles. Culture is context, the discourses, regimes, and assumptions embedded in institutions, and the repertoire of meanings that are marshaled to respond to dilemmas and opportunities. It makes certain action possible by providing the building blocks with which to enact them and by making them as socially appropriate, while restricting others by rendering them unacceptable. So later in the text, she explains that the culture is more likely a contingent clustering of diverse elements that is often on the move rather than a packageable, stable set of beliefs and practices rooted in a particular place. So the whole point of this definition is to show the kind of dynamic nature, the dynamic aspect of culture that I'm using, and that we can also apply when we are talking about culture, material culture later in this discussion. To give you again a framework of where I'm coming from, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a geographer and I also studied anthropology. So the two disciplines that kind of shape my understanding of cultural dynamics is anthropology and geography, and in particular cultural geography. So I look at, and of course for anthropology, culture was the central notion, and anthropologists has contributed a lot to the debate on culture, alterity, the other, and geography looks at the same issue by spatializing our overview on social phenomena. So they look at the role of the territory, the role of the space, of the place. And I should say these two approaches helped me to get into this research, both when I was studying the art market in the Middle East and today that I'm working on the real estate. One of the most interesting features of what we can call critical anthropological approach to migration and culture is to see the study of migration as a socio-cultural phenomena that lets us to broaden our knowledge of the plurality of ways of being, and even beyond the issue of migration. So thinking a little bit through I would say, a phenomenological approach of migration to understand our ways of being, that is not only limited to migrants. Basically, what is at the core of anthropology, alterity, or the other one that helps us to understand who we are as well. And I find that contribution of anthropology very important, because it also helps us getting out of migration studies, or what sometimes in France we call migrantology, in a sense that it's very much limited to migration. And cultural geography also, as I said, has helped us to create this cultural approach with space, place, territory, and various dynamics of anchoring and also mobilities. The other important kind of in this interdisciplinary approach that we need to keep in mind is what has been dubbed since 2000 as mobility paradigm. That is, here the important and pioneering article of Yuri and Mimi, the new mobilities paradigm that was published in 2006, that proposed a new epistemology that takes into account mobility beyond migration movement and combines, studies of travel, tourism, bodily movement and communication, transport, infrastructures, in relation also with migration phenomena and politics, for instance, of citizenship. And I would say the combination of these approaches shaped also what we can call today material culture of migration, because it kind of connected also humanities and social sciences. So the important role of the arts and culture and literature or architecture that became also part of the debate of migration studies. So this framework was important just to get into how the boundaries of material culture of migration as a new, I mean, it's been almost 20, 25 years that we are talking about it, but to show the boundary of material culture of studies, if we want to call it in that way. So the cultural approach in both geography and anthropology has been enriched with material culture studies for more than, I would say, 25 years. We have witnessed a kind of preoccupation with the study of material objects and materiality across social science disciplines. So I put just some important, I would say, references. Obviously, the first one, 1986, one of the oldest kind of approaches of material cultural approach is Arjun Appadurai, The Social Life of Things. But then later on, anthropologists such as Daniel Miller and geographers such as Kelly Tolia, they started working also applying this material approach into their own disciplines. This approach focuses on how objects and things inform us about individual and collective trajectory, the emotion and association that they elicit, and how placemaking and ways of belonging are achieved through the choice or manufacture of objects and the built environment. And therefore, also the question of architecture becomes important. The emotions and functionalities objects embody make them objects of study in their own right and they have the right to better understand how individuals and groups engage in certain actions, mobilize repertoires of meaning, and build their identities, or they identify with certain representations. So thus object biographies, to paraphrase Appadurai, have provided a new methodology for studying social relations, not only between humans, but also between humans and non-humans. How people make, use, exchange, and consume things, but also how these things participate in individual social interactions, constitute a new epistemological approach to capturing the diversity of ways of being. So being a migrant, of course, included. So not surprisingly, this approach has also found some success in migration studies, exploring how migration processes and dynamics, but also mobilities more broadly, contribute to the emergence of new living environment, including their physical dimension, and the production, circulation, exchange, and consumption of new things. Again, here I put some important references that contributed to this approach in migration studies. So, dubbed as well material culture of migration, objects or things acquire in their sense their own agency to explain social phenomena related to migration and diasporic experiences. Relating the life of objects to the different sequences of migration help us explore the link between subjects and objects to study the places where objects are used and transformed and how they relate to intimate space of individuals and their self-identification. So to my view, the material culture methodology, among other approaches, relates to cultural analysis of migration that emphasize on, as I said earlier, on the phenomenological dimension of migration and diasporic experience, focusing on migration and diaspora culture as a mode of existence. I would say something from inside, not from outside. This this book from Noman just came out recently, 2 or 3 months ago, about material culture and forced migration, materializing the transient. And I found this citation quite useful, that self-creation is an important guiding principle. Through active handling of the world of things, people internalize and incorporate culture, that is, social structures, ideas, norms, values, and patterns of action. In his study of the Lebanese diaspora, Gassan Haj insists that this use of the notion of diasporic condition or culture refers to, I quote, a reality that is experienced by those inhabiting it, and how the experience in turn gives this sociocultural formation some of its distinctive characteristics. Through a very lengthy ethnographic survey of the research of the Lebanese diaspora worldwide, has shows clearly that diaspora, I quote, is a way of being in the world, and the way in which the world comes to be. Thus, diasporic signifies a variety of qualities and properties that pertain to both the subjects of the experiences and to social relations, reality, world, milieu, culture, environment in which this subject exists. End of the quote. Paul Basu and Simon Coleman, in their introduction to the mobility, so that's very important article about material culture, in one of the issues of the journal Mobilities, they refer to migrant worlds rather than migration per se. They say, I quote, we are not only concerned with the materiality of migration itself, but also with the material effects of having moved, perhaps many years earlier, to a new place, and with the interrelatedness of the movements of people and things. In addition, we want to convey the sense that a world, an often fragmented and fragile set of material and non-material assumptions and resources, can itself be mobile, seemingly translated from one geographical location to another, even as it is transformed in the process. So they remind us that materiality refers to physical objects and words, but also to evoke, more subjective experiences, sensations, an embodied kind of experience of being a migrant or non-migrant. I mean, there are many examples of excuse me. There are many examples of researchers and scholars who worked on, different objects. For example, think of the key role of mobile phones in irregular migration trajectories, or the memorial role of photos of family and friends, or the suitcase as an object emblematic of travel, accompanying migrants and refugees on their journeys of exodus. The migrant material world also illuminates the strategies of distinction and differentiation deployed by migrants within their groups of belonging in relation to the host and home societies, and the way the modalities of that these strategies are materialized at the geographical scale, at the city scale, or at the domestic space, neighborhood, city. Again, here geography played an important role in articulating different geographical scales. These strategies of distinction and differentiation can be expressed, for instance, through the products consumed by migrants and how they consume them, in themselves indicators of modes of belonging to a new environment, of social, family, and intergenerational links. Where, what, and how products are consumed are rich in meaning for individuals or group strategies and may become vectors of social positioning vis-à-vis others and society at large. Laura Saf, a great anthropologist currently at NYU Abu Dhabi, she studied young Arab migrants' sociability in the city of Abu Dhabi, and she shows how consuming karak, a drink made of black tea, sweet milk, and cardamom, is associated with their strategy of appropriation of the interstitial spaces of the city and helps them build some sense of belonging in an environment where access to citizenship is almost impossible. Through consumption patterns, associated imaginaries, and alternative urban practices, Asaf examines the behavior and the strategies of belonging of young migrants in an exclusionary context. I quote her, "In doing so, they construct a specific version of the Emirati capital, and Abu Dhabi for which belonging does not depend on the nationality on one's passport, but on the intimate knowledge of the city and familiarity, with its diverse inhabitant." End of the quote. Another important material manifestation of migratory trajectories is embedded in housing and homemaking practices, including the architectural forms that emerge from transnational practices. Numerous research projects in cultural geography, anthropology, and cultural studies have focused on the interplay of homemaking and housing issues, fostering new dialogues with other disciplines such as architecture, even though the interest of architecture in migration came kind of later than the interest of anthropologists in migration. What is interesting about the house as an architecture form alongside the numerous studies of homemaking strategies is precisely the way it highlights links between the interior and exterior of living spaces, between domestic habitat and public spaces, between domesticity and displacement. As part of my ongoing study of Iranian migrant home ownership strategies in Toronto, one migrant told me very proudly that he bought a house in a white Canadian suburb. When we entered his home, he showed me a large traditional painting he had bought with him from Iran and the Louis XV style furniture common in some wealthy circles in Iran, transported to Canada by a specialist carrier to recreate the same atmosphere as in his Tehran, the capital of Iran, flat back when he was at the country in Iran. On the one hand, his interior provided the setting for an exclusively Iranian social life, while on the other hand, access to property in a neighborhood perceived as white Canadian evoked a sense of integration into Canadian society. In this case, my analysis may focus on economic, social, and emotional consideration at the individual level or regarding intra-community relations vis-à-vis other Iranians, alongside the aesthetic and material features of this furnishing that led to the decision to transport them from Tehran to Toronto. But I can go further and change the scale by emphasizing the impact of such practices on the creation of new logistic circuits involving numerous intermediary actors, making shipping from Iran to Canada possible despite difficulties caused by international sanctions. I should remind that Iran is under international sanctions since 40 years ago, and so transportation from Iran is extremely difficult. Finally, these individual and collective choices and global circuits resulting from them has also an impact at the city level. since not only have some companies now specialized in this intercontinental transport, but Iranian style furniture shops have become one of the hallmarks of the so-called Iranian neighborhoods of Richmond Hill in Toronto, in the northern of the suburbs of Toronto. So this picture is a picture that I took in the suburbs of Toronto, Iranian neighborhood. As you can see, there are many how do you say, exchange offices, currency exchange offices that bring money from Iran to Canada, but also many furniture shops for newcomers who arrive and they want to buy the type of furniture that they like in Iran. Seen in this way, the house becomes, I quote, a transcultural construct insofar as when migrants inhabit, adapt, purchase, or construct houses, questions are raised about who has access to defining value and meaning, and how the symbolic and cultural narratives of taste and aesthetics are formed. End of the quote. Additionally, architectural forms and their aesthetics become socio-material expressions, often with symbolic dimension, telling us about migratory trajectory. This picture is just a symbolic picture, but it actually exists. It's in India. In India, there are many actually immigrants, Indian immigrants, who went back to India and constructed new houses. They kind of use their own dreams to build a house that reflect their own life. It's a little bit exaggerated, but it does exist. And my colleague Aurélie Varel at CNRS in France studied very well these dynamics between the Gulf and India. As I was saying earlier, such approaches allows us to formulate migration issues both within and beyond migration studies. In a medical anthropology study of the psychological trauma and disorder of Iranians who grew up during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s with Iraq, anthropologist Orkide Behruzan asked her interlocutors in Iran and in diaspora to talk about the consumer goods and day-to-day items that mark their daily lives in those periods. Darugar, it's the shampoo on the right. A bat bottle, it's the emblematic national brand. Or Khersi streaming gums, so the one on the left. Or, for instance, also illegal Betamax video players or other cartoon characters became participated in the memory of this region, of this period of time in Iran. And I should again remind that because of the war with Iraq, we had a very monoculture. We had only one type of shampoo, we had only one type of chewing gum. So this kind of monoculture also participated later in the memory of this generation. The memory of these objects, their frequent use and representation in social networks, recalled wartime camaraderie in a context of economic hardship and international sanctions, constituting a generational memory that links those in the country of origin with the diaspora. In the memory of these objects and their reminiscence, Behruzan sees, I quote, culturally generative venues for the compulsive return of the 1980s. In them, I continue the citation, I look for recursive processes of remembering or forgetting that produce new cultural contexts and generational identities. Given their power to generate emotion and memories, objects has often contributed to diasporic art and design, and how the diaspora represents the experience of migration and exile. They may even feature in their host country's heritage project. In some cases, also in immigration or settlers museums, or also urban history museums. This is one example of an Iranian artist, Afsoon, Her works, she's based in LA. Her works have been extensively exhibited at British Museum, LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum, and she works on these objects that are emblematic of the 80s in Iran within the situation context of war and revolution that I just explained to you. And you can actually find more information about this in a wonderful book of Tallien Grigor, Contemporary Iranian Art from the street to the studio. And very quickly, I just say a few words of what she says about this artwork. As a child, I saw life in many lifeless objects. I imagined a garment desperate to be worn so that it could go out, or a cassette desperate to be played so that it could sing out loud. I should again recall that cassettes, videos, everything was banned in Iran after the Islamic Revolution of 1979. So this political context and these objects together created such a strong, kind of emotional and also aesthetic world that also participated a lot in the diasporic representation of Iranians since the revolution. Another example is Paykan. Paykan was the first car manufactured in Iran. Produced from 1967 to 2015, it started life as a licensed copy of a British car, Hillman, but it nevertheless became a symbol of national pride and modernity and the middle class in Iran before revolution. Paykan later became, part of our everyday life on the streets of Tehran, and all the taxis in Tehran were Paykan. And later, after the revolution, it became so important as a symbol of the everyday life that many artists started using it as a cultural symbol, representing many different narratives that they had about their time. On the right, the lady in front of the Paykan, the car, is from one of the modernist women magazines before revolution. And as you can see, her modernity is very much her modern kind of aspects or features of an Iranian woman is very much related to the kind of matter, the car, the use of the car. In a reversal of a historical trajectory, the Paykan project became, as I was saying, an object, an excuse, a context for many artists in the post-revolutionary period, such as in the work of, for instance, Anahita Razmi, who is a German Iranian second generation. She was born, if I'm not wrong, in Germany, and she used one of these cars she bought, I think, or she got the car to Europe, and you cannot find this car easily. And she drove from Germany to Iran with the car, and she documented the whole journey from Germany to Iran with this car, and that led to an exhibition that it's a mixed media installation consisting of 38 framed documents and 11-hour video that accompany the physical vehicle, which is on display in an art exhibition. Other artists, they also worked and used car to, again, as it became a very important symbol, to the point that today in the Iranian art scene or art world, people, they talk about Paykan art, to the extent that it sometimes has a negative connotation as well, because it has been used and instrumentalized so much. Another example of Paykan car, which is the most recent and emblematic one, is the way Ali Reza Shojai, Iranian artist, queer artist, used Paykan to talk about his work. The reason why he decided to paint very central queer scenes of Iranian gays and homosexual on the car is that in 1974, as a token of connection between Iranian regime and the former regime in Yugoslavia, the Shah of Iran gave a paycon to Nicolae Ceausescu, a Romanian dictator. And the very card made news again in many Iranian circles at home and in diaspora. And the Shojai decided to, use this card because the card that was donated by the Shah of Iran to Ceausescu was sold for 95,000 euros in an art auction in an art auction. So this whole trajectory of the card, the way it was used in some sort of collusion between the two dictators, and then the important kind of emotionally charged as dimension of the paycon pushed Ali Reza Shojai to use it as a way to contest and to talk about abuses in Iran against the gay and queer community. I think I talked already for almost 35, 40. I have one more example. If we have time, I can talk about that. Otherwise,
yes. Okay, thanks.
Okay, perfect. So this just to breathe and to look at this beautiful car painted by Ali Reza Shojai that was exhibited in Toronto. New York Times wrote an article about his work, and it also became some sort of, because he's in diaspora, obviously part of the representation of Iranian diaspora in the West, I would say. The other example, as I was mentioning earlier, is the way these objects can be used in museums, and in museums of immigration or museums of urban history. The Musée National de l'Histoire de l'Immigration in Paris offers an interesting example. You might have heard about it. It opened in 2007 after a very complex kind of institutional gestation, and it is funded around the idea that the museum as a mediator should enable cultural expressions in the broad sense to become a collective heritage of all. And that also applies to the history of immigration in France. It has a space called the Donation Gallery, which brings together objects given by individuals whose lives were directly or indirectly marked by migration, displaying the objects alongside the migration narratives of donors and their families. I quote the writer Flecteau, contribute to the museum ambition to build links with civil society. Gifts are governed by agreements between donors and museum, under which the donors can always withdraw their objects if they wish to do so. For instance, you have a string machine, a soccer table, a mailing machine, a suitcase, a teapot, a stateless person's paper, photos, storyboards, but also some objects that belong to well-known figures of France history. For instance, Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, medal, or the flag of the Union of Jewish Volunteers. So these figures who participated in France history. In this way, the museum participates in a form of institutionalization of migration material culture. They highlight individual and family migratory memories, and they exhibit them in the public space of a museum that links them to France's national heritage and history. By this shift, I quote Flecteau, this shift from the intimate to the public space, from family heritage to national heritage, it confers a certain aura, but also, and above all, legitimizes these cultures. This is certainly a recognition of the importance of migratory phenomena and their capacity to transform dominant material cultures. But one may also wonder whether it is not also a form of distancing and compartmentalizing of migration issue, end of the quote. So that's also another example of using and talking about material culture. So now to conclude, the main advantage of talking about material culture is that it enables us to focus once more on practices and lived experiences, on the importance of localities and their history, and the plurality of ways of living and being, and investigate also to some extent the universal and specific nature of a given system of thought and ideas. In this way, it also makes it possible to question identity beyond identity-based discourses that tend sometimes to homogenize heterogeneous situations, often through an, I would call it, authoritarian type of pedagogy that underlies benevolent political categories that try to manage migration or cultural diversity. It does represent a shift from, to quote Frickman, identity talk to object talk, to better understand the complexity of migrants' life. When people use certain things, they objectify their social relations. I quote Jackson, providing a kind of commentary on their social existence. Just to finish, making objects talk along with migrants and non-migrants who carry, live, exchange, make, or exhibit them allows us to have a more phenomenological questions about the construction of self, always in relation to others, about the emotions and associations they evoke, and the economic and social considerations that are involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I mean, it was a very challenging, impressive lecture, very sophisticated according for economists, for social science. It was very broad. Could you take off your slide? Withdraw your slide, please.
Yes, sure.
Otherwise, you remain, it remain, no. You have to go back and cut the, I cannot do this for you.
Yes, I'm trying to. It's, because usually
there is a bar on the top. It should say stop to connect. Connecting. Because otherwise you remain very small.
I think I found. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So we can see you from close.
Yes.
So I start the comment on your presentation. It was very interesting, very challenging, but you see that the debate among the economists is trying to be more, more standardized, no? So we use, for instance, the World Value Survey to understand diversity. Or, for instance, my group of research is that they use the cultural consumption, so the differences among ethnic group of cultural consumption to understand diversity. So I'm wondering, given that you have a much broader vision of the idea of culture and so on, if both, you consider both a reasonable proxy or that will be distorted? Because one is considering value, the other is considering action, behavior. If I'm saying the migrant, the Arab migrant in general go to theater because they're not part of their own culture. This is, I can compose the consumption of migrant, understand how far are to the national model or how close are to the national model. I can discuss about cultural integration. You understand? So I understand that you have a much broader dynamic idea of culture, but also in this way there is a dynamic because the more they stay in the country destination, the more they consumption culture, more they adjust. Is less polarized, became more similar to the native or at least to the one of the country of destination and so on. But at least they consume more of everything.
I think it's also important, this perspective of economists. The main question, I think, is what do we want to do with the type of knowledge that we produce? In a sense that, what is the final goal, of asking, of raising certain questions? If we keep this question in mind, I think, the production of value, I think the material culture kind of approach is very much inspired by Marxist and Marxian approaches of how the value is produced, right? But it tries to insert some cultural understanding of the way value is also, shaped, produced, and then consumed, and getting into a finer kind of level of individuals, the diversity of, it's very, I mean, it's just anecdote. In When you take the flight in at the airport in Toronto, one of the advertisement in the corridor is, the only thing we have in common is our diversity or our differences. And this, I find that very interesting. And you know what anthropology tries to do is exactly to show this diversity to to for a better understanding of human beings, groups, individuals. Maybe what economists they try to do is try to narrow it down and trying to understand something that has a more clear boundaries and, borders. I think both approaches are complementary, because something, for instance, that I'm very interested in uh, while studying material culture of migration is really the I would say the logistic chain of having products being, transported from one country to another. Let's say if Moroccan migrants, they consume a lot of harissa. I mean, harissa is produced locally usually, but another product. How does this chain is being built from a very economic and also sociological point of view? And here you cannot have these broader definitions that I've just talked about, right? You need to understand what are the economic logics behind this logistic chain. So I think there are complementary, these are complementary approaches, but that are situated at a different scale of, and are trying to answer to different questions sometimes.
Sure. Viola, do you have any question? She's elaborating. And Roberta ha alzato la mano. Roberta, please take the floor.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for this interesting discussion, for this interesting point of view. So my question is, when you suggest us to shift our attention from identity talk to object talk to better understand the complexity of migration phenomenon, don't you think that the dominant culture in the country of destination, but even in the country of departure, can invalidate or limit the material sense of that specific culture? Thank you.
I mean, it's one methodology among others. I'm not saying that material culture should be the only way of studying migration or identity or identification processes. I think at some point, identity-based discourses, that was on my last slide, created some sort of confinement, let's say, like a lockdown for intellectuals, because I mean, that was studied a lot in Foucault's work, that, the order of discourse, as to refer to his own book, is very fragile, is very volatile, it varies, it can, you know, adapt itself. And as a way of studying migration is also limited. So studying materiality and trying to understand how they are composed, how they traveled, and also asking migrants to talk about their own material worlds is a complementary, again, way of, you know, understanding practices. Because, you know, if I tell you how is your life, that's a very, you know, kind of common question in sociology, right? If I tell you, how is your life today? You would say, oh, it's so bad. It's raining and I'm sad. Toronto is so cold. But if I tell you, okay, what are you going to do today? I say, oh, my friend, which is true, is coming from Boston to visit me. We are going to have dinner and we are going to have the. So this is fun, right? And my friend is coming, and so it's just trying to, you know, shape the discourse based on variety of resources.
Thank you.
Are you ready, Viola? No.
I've been thinking about what I could ask since the beginning of the presentation because it's really interesting. It's a very interesting topic, and it reminded me that I've been studying for my first level degree. I've been studying the African dances, right? Moving from Africa to Europe and back to Africa. And what really struck me during that research was something that you might probably meet during your studying the material culture in this way, and that's how the perception of the destination country projects new meanings and renegotiates, right? The practice, the cultural practices, or in this case, the meaning of the objects that belong to a culture. Am I clear?
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
for example, I've been studying how African dances were many. I mean, in origin, you have many dances of different kind because it's a whole continent, and then they go to Europe, and the European audience selects what we need to see as African, and now though you find this kind of cultural product also in Africa because it's given to the tourists as a and so I was thinking how you can find this also in the material culture, which is made of objects and not of performing arts practices, for example. Did you investigate this aspect? I guess did.
Yes, for the artist, and what you said is absolutely right, in the sense that different kinds of mobilities are connected to spaces and places, right? So it's a network of, you know, and each fieldwork, let's say, for instance, art world has its own hubs and flows. And for instance, when I was studying the artwork, I was looking at the art fairs, but also galleries, but also where collectors they were, and you know, these kind of map that is based on hubs and flows of a specific fieldwork changes the whole system, changes also the content of the artwork that is being circulated. And that's what exactly you are saying, in a sense that this Paycon, for instance, the car I just showed you, right? And you know, we should consider power relations as well, in a sense that today in North America more than in Europe, but in Europe as well, talking about the queer culture is part of, you know, the everyday life. It's so important to talk about gender, queer, and so it's interesting to see even within the last 20 years how this Paycon card has evolved from, and now it's very much, it reflects the dynamics, or even I would say expectations of the Western it doesn't mean artists, they don't like to hear that. But it doesn't mean, I mean, for us researchers, it's the same thing, right? I mean, at some point, sometimes we are forced to do, sometimes we don't want to do, and sometimes we are happy to consider these new approaches of gender or whatever.
It's about the I don't know if you remember, but probably, I mean, you all know about this, the definition of the pure products, right? The pure products of America
Right. Yeah.
going crazy. It's, I mean, they don't exist. They cannot exist anywhere. So they are always changing according to the audience. And yeah.
And I just want to add something about a category that we can call mediators, or Peggy Levitt, she calls them vernaculizers. And I think these actors are very important in circulating and in creating the mobilities, but also in changing the expressions and cultural expressions and adapting them, creating a new narrative. Think of, for instance, curators, right, in the artwork. They play such an important role in translating the expressions in a broad, sense of it.
Yeah, thank you.
In a certain way, that the curator, and so they translate, they adapt, so they integrate the message.
Right.
Because
sometimes they even limit. I was in Dubai, and there was a talk with a curator, and I loved the artist that she was presenting, but I thought that the discourse, the rhetoric that she was framing for his work was very limiting. And I told her, I said, well, are you sure that the artist agrees with you, actually? And, because it was in Dubai. Yeah.
Marinella Senatore, you meant?
No, it was another curator who was working with Iranian artists and representing them in Dubai. And I found that the discourse was very limiting instead of expanding the meanings of the work of the artist,
Yes, but certain way they are like seller.
Yes.
They are not, they are marketing, so they adjust with the prejudice or with ideas that the public has, the product that they want to present. There was a professor at University of Torino who died 10 years ago, Walter Santagda. He was always speaking about gallery of that discover the artist, a market gallery. That means the gallery that diffuse the art. While the first is really strict to the message of the artist, the second one tried to adjust it to the public because it's a market. So they try to optimize the return of the exhibit, also for a monetary return for the artist, but sometimes distorting the message of the artist. But as you see, Peggy, Wimke Sieber, they always study why artists for peripheral region do not find success in the main fora. This is the reason. If they don't have a good artist, who is able to translate, to make appeal, to create some appeal around, become very difficult.
Absolutely.
And even if they are criticized because they don't respect, they are doing a market action. So I don't know if they do a cultural action, is not their priority. Their priority is the market. So the effect is on the culture after that. So if the other speakers are silent, the students are always silent. They found that the lecture was very interesting, challenging, but they are not clever enough to intervene. So we thank Amin very much for the presentation. You asked the slide to put on the web. Thank you very much.
Yes, some pictures are from, press. And so I will write through about that, because some pictures are mine and some others are from...
If you have to take them, because it will be published for the student that follow the seminar, so it will be reserved. You let me know. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.